Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe, hit the bell, like, comment, and share.
It began on a night when the air trembled softly, as if the universe itself was remembering a dream. The rain outside was quiet but deliberate, tapping against glass and metal, filling the garage with the scent of cold dust and oil. Rick sat at his bench, hunched over something that didn't exist yet. The dim yellow light above him flickered, struggling to stay awake. On the wall, a clock ticked, slow and uneven, like a heart that had forgotten its rhythm. He was younger then, his hair still more gray than white, his eyes still holding the shimmer of questions that hadn't yet hardened into answers. The world beyond his window was small and familiar, but his mind kept drifting elsewhere. Between the hum of the tools and the soft crackle of static from an old radio, he could almost hear something breathing, a low cosmic sigh slipping through the cracks of reality. He looked up, half expecting to see someone there, but it was only the dust dancing in the lamplight, suspended like tiny galaxies waiting to be named. He'd been awake for 3 days. His notebook lay open, filled with diagrams that made sense only to him, lines looping back into themselves like thoughts that couldn't escape. He pressed the pen to paper again, but stopped halfway through a formula. Somewhere deep inside him, a quiet ache pulsed, the kind that had nothing to do with science. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent light hummed above him, a sound that reminded him of his mother's sewing machine, the way it used to fill the kitchen with a rhythm that was oddly comforting. He hadn't thought of her in years. She'd once told him, "Ricky, even stars get tired." He'd laughed then, dismissing it as one of those sentimental things parents said. But now, sitting alone in the dim yellow glow, he wondered if she'd been right. Maybe even stars burned out, not from losing fuel, but from losing meaning. Outside, thunder rolled softly, like a giant turning in its sleep. The storm was patient. It waited just like him. He stood up and walked to the window, pressing his palm to the glass. The reflection that stared back was tired but defiant. A man who'd seen too much of the possible and not enough of the personal. The raindrops on the glass caught the light, turning the reflection into something shimmering and broken, his own face dissolving into starlight. He whispered to himself, "You still there, old man?" and half smiled. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, maybe to the version of himself that hadn't yet built a way out of his own loneliness. The radio crackled again, tuning itself by accident. Through the static came the faintest sound, a lullaby, a child's voice, almost mechanical, repeating a few lost notes from some forgotten world. Rick froze. He didn't remember turning it on. The melody wasn't from Earth. It was soft, circular, the kind of sound that looped endlessly, comforting in its repetition. He let it play, and the air in the room seemed to settle. For the first time in days, he exhaled. He sat back down and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the garage disappeared. He saw instead the outline of a field, the one from his childhood, where the grass brushed against his knees and the world had no corners yet. He saw a boy sitting under a broken telescope, whispering questions to the sky. That boy had believed the stars could hear him, that the universe was listening. He opened his eyes again. The rain had slowed. The silence felt alive. On the table before him sat a half-assembled device, something between a lens and a portal. He'd been building it to look deeper into reality, but the more he stared at it, the more it looked like a mirror, a way not to see beyond, but within. He ran his fingers along the edge of the glass, tracing invisible shapes. The reflection shifted, and for a fleeting moment, he saw himself as he used to be, barefoot, laughing, holding a jar of fireflies. Then the image was gone, replaced by the dull surface of metal and glass. He whispered, "You're not supposed to remember that." But he did. Every flicker of light, every echo of laughter, every gentle voice that had told him to rest. He'd spent his life running from that tenderness, replacing it with equations and circuitry. He built machines to avoid memories, but memories were patient. They waited in corners of the mind like unopened doors. He reached for his flask, took a sip, and winced. The warmth spread through him, a quiet hum beneath his ribs. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind a strange, clean silence. Outside, the clouds had broken apart, revealing a sky so dark it felt endless. And in that darkness, something shimmered, a faint green pulse, like a heartbeat beyond the stars. Rick stared at it, blinking once, twice. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of exhaustion. But the pulse continued, steady and familiar. He felt it not just in his eyes, but in his chest, a rhythm that matched his own. It was the same pattern he'd been sketching earlier, without realizing why. He grabbed the notebook, flipped through the pages, and stopped at the one where the formula broke off mid-line. The pulse outside blinked again. He drew the missing symbol. The moment his pen touched the page, The lights in the garage flickered and dimmed. The radio hissed. The air thickened. And then for one suspended second, everything went still. It wasn't dramatic, no explosion, no revelation, just a soft, widening quiet, a silence that felt alive. Rick looked up. The pulse outside had faded. The night sky seemed to lean closer, pressing its cold forehead against the window pane. He felt an odd calm, like something had finally aligned. He whispered, "Okay, I see you." And in that whisper, something inside him loosened. The years of running, inventing, escaping, it all felt smaller, lighter. He wasn't sure what he'd connected to. Maybe it wasn't science at all. Maybe it was memory or grace. He stayed there for a long time, breathing quietly. The hum of the machines became softer, almost like breathing beside him. His eyelids grew heavy. For the first time in years, he didn't resist the pull of sleep. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half open, watching the stars drift across the window like fireflies. As he dozed, a thought floated through his mind, barely a whisper. Maybe being human was never about staying the same. Maybe it was about remembering what it felt like to care. A small smile touched his lips, faint and unguarded. The radio, as if responding, played the lullaby once more. The melody looped, fading gently into static. Outside, the night deepened. The garage lights dimmed to a pale, forgiving glow, and somewhere far above in that endless dark, the stars began to move again, slowly, carefully whispering his name back to him in languages he'd forgotten how to speak. Rick stirred, not fully awake, not fully dreaming. His hand rested on the unfinished device, fingers curled as if holding something fragile. The pulse beneath his skin matched the rhythm of the universe, slow and eternal. In that space between waking and sleep, he felt it, the quiet truth he'd been chasing all his life. That knowledge and loneliness were never meant to live apart. That love, even when buried under genius, still hums in the background, waiting to be remembered. He exhaled once more, deeply this time, as if releasing the weight of every galaxy he'd ever carried. The sound of it was almost a sigh, almost a song. The rain began again, softer now, as if the sky had decided to comfort him. The tools on the bench shimmered faintly in the dim light, and the clock ticked back into rhythm. Rick fell asleep, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't dream of escape. He dreamed of warmth, of voices he'd loved, of a night sky that still knew his name. The garage settled into silence, the kind that only exists at the edge of sleep. And outside, somewhere beyond the thin walls of that little world, the stars kept watching, patient, forgiving, endless. Long before the garage, before the rain and the silence of inventions, there was a boy who wanted to understand everything. His name was still Rick, though it sounded softer when his mother said it. The world then was smaller fields instead of galaxies, clocks instead of timelines. His mind, even as a child, moved like lightning behind still eyes. While other children chased shadows and shouted into the wind, Rick took apart alarm clocks, radios, anything that hummed or clicked. He wanted to know why things worked, not just that they did. On quiet afternoons, when the air was heavy with summer and the light pressed against the windows like warm water, he would sit on the floor of his room surrounded by open machines. Springs and gears lay scattered around him like tiny constellations. His father would sometimes step into the doorway, watching silently, uncertain whether to interrupt the strange focus that made the boy seem older than he should be. "Ricky," his mother would call from the kitchen. "You'll ruin your eyes staring at those things." He would answer softly, not looking up. "I'm not staring. I'm listening." And she'd smile, because she didn't understand, but she loved the way he said it, as if machines were alive, whispering secrets through their wires. At night, when the cicadas sang outside and the sky pulsed with slow-moving stars, he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling. He wondered where thoughts went when they ended. If they drifted somewhere, gathering like dust at the edges of space. Sometimes he'd imagine the universe as a clock too, a vast mechanism wound by something older than time. If he could just find its gears, maybe he could understand why people laughed, why they cried, why they left. He was 8 when he built his first telescope from the parts of a broken lamp and an old camera lens. It didn't work perfectly, but through it he could see enough, a soft blur of stars that felt impossibly close. He called them neighbors, and every night he greeted them like friends. The sky didn't answer, but it listened, and that was enough. His father, a quiet man of calloused hands, worried about him. He once sat beside Rick in the yard, both looking up. "You keep staring up there like it's going to talk back," he said. Rick replied, "Maybe it already is." His father laughed, shaking his head. "You'll end up too smart for your own good, boy." But Rick didn't see it as intelligence. He saw it as necessity. The world inside him was too loud. The stars made it quieter. As he grew, so did his restlessness. School was too small for the questions he carried. Teachers would praise his mind but sigh at his distance. He'd sit by the window while equations filled the board, his gaze fixed on something no one else could see. When asked to explain his thoughts, he'd pause too long, then mutter, "It's not ready yet." They thought he was odd. Maybe he was. One day during a storm that turned the sky green, he discovered something that changed him. He'd been trying to wire a radio that could pick up frequencies from further away, further than any ordinary signal. As lightning crackled and rain pounded against the roof, his makeshift antenna caught something. A sound. Not a voice. Not exactly, but a tone. A single sustained note that vibrated through his chest like the hum of the earth itself. It lasted only a few seconds, but when it stopped, he felt hollow, as if something had looked at him and moved on. He told no one, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew no one would believe him. He wrote about it instead in the back of his notebook, hidden among the drawings of circuits and stars. That page stayed with him for years, smudged and folded, its words written in uneven lines. "There's something out there that knows I exist." From then on, every invention carried a quiet hope that he might one day hear that sound again. He began to notice patterns in the smallest things. The rhythm of the washing machine, the hum of streetlights, the pulse of his own heartbeat. Everything seemed to be waiting, like the universe was clearing its throat before speaking. He wasn't lonely then, not exactly. But he carried a feeling that never left, a soft disconnection, as though the world around him was real, but slightly transparent. His friends would run through fields, chasing each other, shouting nonsense into the sky. Rick would follow, laughing when expected, but his eyes always drifted upward. One evening, as the sun fell low and the grass turned gold, his mother sat beside him on the porch. She watched him draw in his notebook, pages filled with sketches of stars, strange machines, faces he half remembered. "What are you making this time?" she asked gently. "A map," he said. "To where?" He paused, chewing on the end of his pencil. "To the place where questions go when people stop asking them." She smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "You've got too big a heart for a boy your age." "It's not my heart," he murmured. "It's my brain." But she shook her head. "No, Rick, you think with both." That night, he dreamed of a sky split open by light. Not frightening light, but kind light. The kind that seemed to recognize him. When he woke, he could still hear the hum from his dream. The same tone from the storm years before. It pulsed faintly behind his ribs, as if he'd swallowed a secret. He began to write letters he never sent, to no one in particular. Sometimes to the stars, sometimes to whatever made them. He asked if they were lonely too. He asked why things had to end. The pages filled his shoebox under his bed, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. When he turned 13, he built a new device. Smaller than his hand, meant to capture cosmic static. It worked for a few seconds before burning out. But in that brief flash, he swore he heard laughter. Not human laughter, but something warm and endless. As if the universe itself found his effort amusing. He laughed back, and for the first time, the sound didn't echo. It harmonized. Years later, when the man he'd become would tear open realities and stare into endless voids, he would still remember that sound. The way it felt like being seen without being known. The way it left him both comforted and curious. For now, though, he was just a boy under a wide, forgiving sky. He sat in the grass with his telescope beside him, notebook open, the world breathing quietly around him. The crickets sang, the air shimmered with the warmth of life, and in that soft hour before sleep, he whispered a promise into the dark. "One day I'll find out why you're whispering," he said. "And when I do, I'll listen." The wind moved through the trees, slow and thoughtful, as if nodding in return. He lay back, feeling the earth beneath him, solid and humming with unseen energy. His eyes fluttered shut, and the stars above seemed to lean closer, tracing faint silver lines over his dreaming face. Somewhere in the distance, a radio hissed into silence. The night deepened, the sound of the world folding gently inward, and the boy drifted off, half human, half question, carried softly by the universe he was already trying to understand. By the time Rick turned 17, his room had become less of a bedroom and more of a laboratory. The walls were hidden behind chalkboards covered in equations that looked more like constellations than math. Glass jars of unknown liquids caught the light from his desk lamp, casting quiet galaxies onto the floor. The air always smelled faintly of solder and burnt circuits, and his mother often stood in the doorway, hesitant to breathe too loudly, afraid she might disturb the strange gravity that filled that room. He'd stopped sleeping much. His dreams were too vivid, too close to his waking thoughts. At night, when the world outside went still, he would work with the window open, listening to the insects hum, as though they were keeping time with the pulse in his wrists. He was trying to build something that didn't yet have a name, something between a telescope and a heart. a device that could hold entire worlds. The idea had come to him after another of those sleepless nights when memory and invention blurred together. He wanted to see not just the stars, but what lay between them, the faint breath of the universe itself. If the cosmos is alive, he murmured once, then there must be a way to bottle a heartbeat. And so, he built one. A small glass sphere with layers of circuitry, woven like veins, pulsing faintly with blue light. He didn't know what to call it at first. It wasn't a machine. Not really. It was something quieter, more delicate, something that listened. When it was finished, he placed it gently on his desk and stared at it for hours. It seemed to hum not a sound he could hear, but one he could feel behind his ribs. His hand trembled when he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the glass, the room filled with light. It wasn't bright, not harsh or blinding. It was soft, the kind of light that exists just before dawn. The objects around him, his books, his notes, the chair by the window, all shimmered and shifted, becoming something else as though the world was exhaling into another shape. Rick stumbled back, heart pounding, but the fear didn't last. Because what he saw inside the glass wasn't chaos. It was beauty. There were clouds, tiny, slow-moving clouds of color, gold, violet, green, swirling like thoughts that had taken physical form. Between them floated fragments of rock and light, drifting in a rhythm that felt almost intentional. It was a world, a living, breathing miniature universe, smaller than his hand. He laughed then quietly at first, then louder, the sound sharp with disbelief. "I did it," he whispered. "I actually did it." He watched it for hours, the way its lights dimmed and flared as though it were responding to him. He spoke to it without realizing, his voice gentle, almost tender. "You're alive, aren't you? You understand me." Of course, there was no answer. But when he leaned closer, the light inside the sphere brightened. From that day, the glass world became his secret companion. He would carry it to school, hidden in his bag, just to glance at it between classes. When he felt overwhelmed, he'd take it out late at night, hold it close, and watch the soft galaxies turn. It calmed him. It made him believe he wasn't alone. His parents didn't know about it. His friends, if they could be called that, wouldn't have understood. The sphere became a quiet kind of solace, a reflection of everything he couldn't say. He began to think of it less as a creation and more as a mirror. When he was angry, its colors grew red and sharp. When he was calm, it shimmered pale blue. When he was lonely, it dimmed almost completely. One evening, as the sun fell behind the trees, he took it outside to the field where he'd once stared up at the stars as a child. The grass was cool beneath him, the smell of earth rich and grounding. He set the sphere in the grass and lay back beside it, staring upward. "If I can make a world," he murmured, "does that make me responsible for it?" The wind didn't answer. The sphere glowed faintly, the light dancing across his face like a heartbeat. He thought of the tone he'd heard years ago, the one from the storm. Maybe this was it, returned in another form. A reminder that everything he reached for was already reaching back. Days passed, and his attachment to the sphere deepened. He began to lose interest in everything else, school, friends, even sleep. His notebooks filled with sketches of the tiny universe, maps of its structure, attempts to calculate its lifespan. He couldn't explain why, but he felt it fading, like something alive that needed care. He tried feeding it energy, light, heat, music, but the glow kept weakening. One night, desperate, he held it in both hands and whispered, "Don't go." His voice cracked. "I made you. I can fix you." But the light continued to dim. He saw the clouds collapse inward, the colors draining to gray, and in that fading glow, he saw something that made his breath stop. A reflection of himself, not his face exactly, but his expression, the same exhaustion, the same quiet ache. He realized then that the world he'd built wasn't dying. It was mirroring him. Every sleepless night, every lonely thought, every unanswered question had drained it, because he'd filled it with his own emptiness. It was never meant to be a creation. It had always been a confession. Tears slipped down his cheeks before he noticed. He wiped them away, ashamed, and whispered, "I'm sorry." He didn't expect a response. But the moment the words left his mouth, the sphere flickered. Faint light pulsed through it again, weak, but alive. It wasn't a recovery, not really. It was forgiveness. Rick held it to his chest, the warmth seeping into his skin. He stayed that way until morning, half asleep, dreaming of stars breathing in sync with his own lungs. By sunrise, the sphere had gone dark again, but the silence it left behind wasn't empty. It was peaceful. He buried it that morning beneath the old tree at the edge of the field. The soil was damp, the air soft with dew. He pressed his palm against the ground and said nothing. For a moment, the earth glowed faintly where he'd placed it, then faded into ordinary dirt. The wind rustled the leaves above him, and he thought he heard something familiar in it, a faint echo of that same tone he'd once heard through the radio, the sound of being seen. He didn't build anything for weeks after that. He just wandered, watched the world, listened, and slowly, without meaning to, he began to understand something that no machine had ever told him. That creation wasn't control, it was surrender. Years later, when he would build devices that could tear through dimensions and worlds far stranger than that little sphere, he would still remember that first creation buried beneath the tree. Sometimes, in the middle of his greatest discoveries, he'd pause for no reason and glance upward, half expecting to see its faint glow returning from the stars. He never found it again, but sometimes on nights when the air trembled softly, he could feel it, the quiet pulse of a small, forgiving world still breathing somewhere in the dark. Morty was 7 the first time he stayed overnight in Rick's garage. It was raining that night, soft and heavy. The kind of rain that made the air smell clean. The light from the workbench painted everything in pale gold. The tools, the shelves, the tangle of wires that never seemed to end. Morty sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, watching his grandfather move between inventions like a conductor, leading an invisible orchestra. Every sound was part of a rhythm. The hiss of the soldering iron, the low hum of a generator, the steady tap of Rick's fingers against the metal frame of something that looked half alive. "Grandpa," Morty whispered, his voice trembling a little. "What if the stars go out?" Rick didn't look up. He adjusted a dial, squinted, muttered to himself. "They won't. Not all at once, anyway." "But what if they do?" Rick sighed. He set the tool down and turned toward the boy, eyes soft with something almost human. "Then we'll build new ones." Morty smiled, half believing him, half just comforted by the certainty in his voice. He'd always been afraid of the dark, but in that garage, surrounded by the hum of machines and the smell of oil, the dark felt smaller. Rick handed him a flashlight. "Keep this on. The darkness only wins if you stop looking." Morty clicked it on and the beam caught dust floating in the air. Tiny orbs suspended like lazy stars. "Are these mini-universes?" Rick chuckled. "No, Morty, just dust. But that's how universes start, little things that think they don't matter." Morty didn't really understand, but he liked how it sounded. He looked around, his small fingers tracing the edge of a broken monitor. "Do you ever sleep, Grandpa?" Rick shrugged. "Sometimes, when the noise in my head gets quiet enough." Morty tilted his head. "Is it loud in there?" Rick gave a small laugh, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You have no idea." The rain deepened, a slow percussion on the roof. Morty tucked the blanket tighter around himself, flashlight beam steady on his knees. Rick returned to his work, but his hands moved slower now, as if Morty's question had lingered in the air longer than it should have. He glanced at the boy again. Morty's hair was a messy crown of curls, his eyes wide and bright, reflecting everything. Rick remembered himself at that age, awake at night, asking the sky impossible questions. The memory was sharp, almost tender. He felt it press against him like a bruise. "Morty," he said after a while, "you don't have to understand everything right now." "I want to," Morty murmured. "You know so much, and I just want to know it too." Rick picked up a small device from the bench, a round metallic sphere with blinking lights. Knowing isn't the same as understanding. Sometimes it's heavier. He tossed it lightly to Morty. The boy caught it clumsily, giggling, as the lights blinked faster in his hands. "What is it?" "Call it a thought keeper," Rick said, waving a hand. "It records things you think too hard about, keeps them from crowding your head." Morty turned it over in his palms, fascinated. "Does it work for you?" Rick hesitated. It used to. A long silence settled between them, filled only by rain and the slow hum of the machines. Morty pressed the thought keeper to his chest and whispered, "Maybe you should use it again." Rick blinked, caught off guard. "Why's that?" "'Cause you look tired." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit like a soft hammer. He opened his mouth to say something clever, something dismissive, but the words refused to come. He turned back to his tools, pretending the conversation hadn't touched him. Morty yawned, his flashlight beam wobbling before falling still. Within minutes he was asleep. Small and peaceful, the thought keeper still glowing faintly in his hands. Rick watched him for a long time. The sight stirred something deep inside, a quiet ache he'd long buried. He remembered his daughter as a child, curled up in the same position, asleep on the couch while he worked. He remembered promising her he'd take a break soon, that he'd be there more. He never had been. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment he thought he saw the reflection of that old glass sphere from years ago, the one he'd buried under the tree. It pulsed faintly in his memory, alive in a way no invention ever should have been. He wondered if it still existed somewhere, quietly glowing under roots and soil. He whispered without meaning to, "You still there, little world?" Morty stirred in his sleep, mumbling something soft. Rick froze, afraid to wake him. But the boy only turned over and sighed, his small fingers still clutching the device. Rick exhaled slowly. He stood and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving everything coated in silver reflections. He could see the stars now, faint behind the lingering clouds. They seemed distant, unbothered, eternal, and yet tonight, they looked almost kind. He thought of what he'd told Morty, that they could build new stars if the old ones ever went out. It was something his younger self would have believed completely. Now, though, he wasn't so sure. Maybe the stars didn't need rebuilding. Maybe people did. He turned back toward Morty, sleeping soundly, blanket half fallen to the floor. Rick picked it up and tucked it around him again. The boy murmured something incoherent, then smiled in his sleep. Rick felt the corners of his own mouth lift slightly. "Don't ever lose that," he whispered. "The part of you that still smiles in your sleep." He sat down again, the sound of the rain now replaced by the hum of his thoughts. The garage felt different somehow, warmer, alive. He looked at the messy sprawl of inventions, all those unfinished ideas scattered like pieces of a conversation he could never quite complete. He realized then that for all his brilliance, he'd never truly invented anything that made him feel less alone. Machines couldn't listen. Portals couldn't love. Even his smallest creations, no matter how alive they seemed, only mirrored the hollowness he carried. But this moment, quiet and unremarkable, was different. Morty's breathing, steady and soft, the dim light reflecting off his hair, the silence filled not with loneliness, but presence. It was the kind of moment that didn't need to be understood. It only needed to be kept. He looked at the thought keeper glowing faintly in Morty's hands. Maybe it was working after all. Maybe it wasn't about recording what was thought, but what was felt. Rick leaned back, closing his eyes for a while. He didn't sleep, but the edges of exhaustion softened, turning into something gentler. The hum of the machines became a lullaby, one he hadn't realized he'd been writing all along. Outside, the night deepened. The rain had washed the air clean. The stars blinked faintly, reflected in puddles on the ground. Somewhere, far beyond sight, another universe turned quietly, patient as always. Rick opened his eyes once more. He reached over and dimmed the light, letting the darkness breathe around them. Morty shifted, but didn't wake. The flashlight, still clutched in his small hand, cast a final beam against the wall, a circle of soft white light that trembled, then held steady. Rick watched it for a while. The same dust from before floated through it, shimmering like tiny worlds. He smiled faintly. Maybe Morty hadn't been wrong after all. Maybe universes did start small, just a spark of wonder held long enough for it to matter. He whispered into the quiet, "Sleep well, kid. The stars aren't going anywhere tonight." And for the first time in a long while, Rick meant it. The morning crept in quietly, sliding between the half-drawn blinds like thin threads of gold. The garage smelled of metal, dust, and faint ozone, the scent of machines that had dreamed all night but never rested. Morty stirred beneath his blanket, blinking up at the flickering ceiling light. For a second, he didn't remember where he was. Then he saw Rick slumped in his chair, head tilted back, snoring softly, and everything came rushing back. The rain, the stars, the little glowing orb still nestled in his hands. He sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. The thought keeper pulsed faintly in his palm, warm and alive, like it knew he'd woken. Morty held it up to the light, eyes wide with wonder. The tiny lights within it shifted and danced, forming shapes he couldn't quite understand, almost like it was trying to speak. "Morning, Morty." Rick's voice came low and rough, not opening his eyes. "You sleep okay?" Morty nodded, then realized Rick couldn't see him. "Yeah. Did you?" Rick grunted. To find sleep, he sat up, rubbing his face, the lines of exhaustion etched deep into his skin. "You didn't touch anything you shouldn't have, right?" Morty quickly hid the orb behind his back. No, just looked around." Rick gave him a long look, then smirked. "Kid, you're about as subtle as a plasma grenade." He gestured lazily. "Let me see it." Morty hesitated, then brought the orb out slowly. "It's still glowing," he said, almost in awe. "Like it's alive or something." Rick took it, turning it over in his hands. The faint light reflected in his eyes, making them look younger for a moment. "It's not alive. It's just listening." "Listening to what?" Rick paused, the question hanging heavier than he expected. "Us," he said finally. "Or maybe just me. It's hard to tell the difference these days." Morty frowned. "You mean it hears what we think?" Rick chuckled, but there was something hollow underneath it. Don't worry, Morty. The only thing it'll find in your head is cereal jingles and math homework. Morty's cheeks flushed. That's not true. I think about real stuff sometimes. Rick raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? Like what? Morty looked down at his hands. Like, if people remember us after we're gone. Rick froze for half a second before looking away. You're getting way too philosophical for breakfast time, Morty. I just mean, Morty continued, you build all these crazy things, portals, machines, universes, and I was wondering if you ever make something just to remember a person, like, for real. Rick tapped the orb lightly with his finger. Every invention is a memory, Morty. You just gotta know where to look. Before Morty could answer, a sudden crackle came from the far corner of the garage. Sparks danced across a half-finished device on the workbench. Something large, circular, humming with low, uneven energy. Rick's eyes snapped to it instantly. Ah, hell, he muttered, jumping to his feet. I told myself not to leave that thing running overnight. Morty backed up a little. What is it? Prototype, Rick said, quickly reaching for a switch. Quantum resonance stabilizer, or at least it was supposed to be. The hymn deepened. The air itself seemed to bend, the edges of the room blurring like a mirage. Morty felt a pressure in his ears. Then in his chest, a strange pulsing vibration that made his teeth ache. Grandpa, stay back, Rick barked. He grabbed a metal rod, slamming it against the base of the device. Sparks flew. The machine groaned, its core flickering from blue to red. Skan, don't you dare blow on me now. A burst of light exploded outward, blinding for a split second. Then everything fell silent. The machine dimmed, smoke curling from its edges. Rick stood panting, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the fading glow. Morty blinked away the afterimage. Is it okay? Rick didn't answer right away. He stared at the core, expression unreadable. Then softly, it's fine, just got ahead of itself. He turned toward Morty, trying to force a grin. See, nothing to worry about. But Morty wasn't fooled. He saw the way Rick's hands trembled as he set the rod down, the way his gaze flickered back toward the stabilizer, as if it had whispered something only he could hear. Grandpa, Morty said quietly. What was it really supposed to do? Rick hesitated. Doesn't matter, it's old work. I shouldn't have left it out. But Rick cut him off with a sharp wave. Drop it, Morty. His tone wasn't angry, just tired. He moved back to his chair, sinking into it with a sigh. You want pancakes or something? Go tell your mom I'll be in later. Morty stood there a moment longer, looking between Rick and the faintly smoking machine. Something about it didn't feel like an accident. It felt alive, almost like it had recognized Rick. He swallowed hard. Okay, he said, voice small. Rick didn't look up. Good kid. Morty slipped out of the garage, closing the door gently behind him. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, leaving Rick alone again in the dim light. He waited until the silence settled, then got up slowly and approached the stabilizer. The air still buzzed faintly around it. He pressed his hand against the metal frame, feeling the residual warmth. Still trying to wake up, huh? He murmured. Guess I can't blame you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic shard, the missing piece he'd never meant to finish. He held it over the machine's center, the light from the orb still faintly glowing across his knuckles. I shut you down for a reason, he whispered. Don't make me regret it. The stabilizer pulsed once, softly, like a heartbeat. Rick closed his eyes. The image that flashed through his mind wasn't a schematic or formula, it was a face. His daughter's, younger, laughing, paint on her hands. Then another Morty, asleep on the floor. The thought keeper clutched in his grip. The machine flickered again. Rick stepped back, breath unsteady. No, he muttered. Not now. He slammed the power switch, cutting the light instantly. The garage plunged into half-darkness, broken only by the hum of old circuits cooling. He sank into his chair again, rubbing his temples. You're losing it, Sanchez, he whispered to himself. Machines don't talk. Memories don't follow you home. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Memories were the only things that didn't leave. They just changed shape, turned into inventions, ghosts, orbits around the people you tried to protect. Outside, Morty's laughter drifted faintly through the window. His mother had found him, probably scolding him for sneaking out so early. Rick listened for a moment, eyes softening. He looked down at the thought keeper sitting on the table, still glowing faintly. He reached for it, thumb brushing over its smooth surface. For the briefest instant, he thought he heard something. A whisper, faint and familiar. A child's voice. He froze. Then the sound was gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the garage and the faint ticking of a broken clock. Rick stared at the orb for a long time, his reflection warping across its surface. Finally, he set it down gently beside his tools and leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The garage felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The stabilizer was silent, but he could still feel its pulse somewhere in the floor, in the hum of the air. And though he would never admit it out loud, part of him hoped it would wake again, not to destroy, but to remember. The nights grew longer after that. Rick noticed it in the smallest ways. The way the shadows stretched across his tools. The way the stars outside seemed just a little farther away. Sleep came in short, broken intervals. And when it did, it brought dreams that weren't dreams at all. They were memories, replaying themselves out of order, stitched together by something that felt almost intentional. Sometimes he'd see the tree again, the one where he'd buried the small glass world so many years ago. In the dream, it was always glowing faintly from within, as if the soil itself remembered. And when he knelt beside it, he could hear a voice, faint, genderless, childlike, asking him if he'd kept his promise. He never answered. The dream would dissolve before he could. He'd wake with the echo still in his ears and find the thought keeper glowing faintly on the workbench, as if it too had been dreaming. Rick didn't talk about it. Not to Morty, not to anyone, but the silence began to press against him, heavy and relentless. He tried to lose himself in work, new machines, new distractions, but every schematic seemed to curve back toward the same design, a circular core pulsing faintly, waiting to be filled with something it could never hold. One night, after another failed experiment, Rick stood at the open garage door, staring out at the sky. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you realize how alive the world really is beneath the surface. Crickets whispered from the grass. The hum of the city in the distance felt like breathing. He tilted his head back, watching the stars until they blurred. "Still up, Grandpa." Morty's voice came from behind him, soft and sleepy. The boy was wrapped in a blanket, hair messy, eyes squinting against the garage light. Rick didn't turn around. "You should be in bed, Morty." "I couldn't sleep," Morty murmured. "The orb, that thing, it started glowing again. I thought maybe something was wrong." Rick glanced back at the workbench. The thought keeper sat where he'd left it. Its light steady, calm. "It's fine," he said. "Just remembering, I guess." "Remembering what?" Rick smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "That's the question, isn't it?" Morty stepped closer, curious. "It's weird, Grandpa. Every time it glows, I feel like it's thinking about something. Like it's got feelings or something." Rick gave a low chuckle. "You're giving too much credit to a ball of quantum glass, Morty. It's just reacting to energy fields. Heat, movement, maybe even brainwaves. That's all." Morty frowned. "But you don't really believe that, do you?" Rick looked at him for a long moment. The kid's face was open, innocent, unshielded by the cynicism that had long corroded Rick's own. He wanted to say no. He wanted to say yes. In the end, he said nothing. Instead, he reached down, picked up the orb, and handed it to Morty. "If it means that much to you, keep it for tonight. See if it dreams." Morty blinked, surprised. "You sure?" Rick nodded. "Just don't drop it, or eat it, or try to use it as a nightlight." Morty smiled faintly. "Okay." He cradled the orb in both hands like something sacred. As he turned to leave, Rick's voice stopped him. "Hey, Morty." "Yeah?" "If it starts talking," Rick said softly, "don't answer it." Morty frowned, but nodded. "Got it." Rick watched him go, the boy's silhouette framed against the soft light of the hall. When the door finally closed, he was alone again. The silence pressed in harder this time. He sat down at the workbench, staring at the empty space where the orb had been. For a moment, he thought about following Morty just to make sure, but something inside him held back. It was better this way. Safer. Still, sleep refused to come. He poured himself another drink, then another, until the edges of his thoughts began to blur. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, and whispered, "You seeing this? Huh? You happy now?" There was no answer. Only the low hum of machines, the faint tick of the cooling stabilizer, and the steady rhythm of his own pulse, loud enough to remind him he was still human. Upstairs, Morty lay awake in bed, the orb resting beside him on the pillow. Its glow filled the room with soft, breathing light. He watched it for a while, wondering if Rick was right, if it could dream. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he did, the dream came quickly. He was standing beneath a vast sky that shimmered like water. The air was cool, rippling with quiet sound, something like laughter, something like wind. In front of him floated the orb. Only now it was huge, hanging in the air like a second moon. He reached out. The surface rippled. Then he saw images, faint, ghost-like scenes flickering inside, a boy with silver hair kneeling in a field, a small glowing sphere in his hands, a woman's voice calling from far away, a storm breaking open the sky. Morty didn't understand it, but it felt real. Then he heard the voice. Why do you keep making things that can feel? Morty froze. The voice wasn't Rick's. It was soft, distant, layered, like two people speaking at once. I don't know what you mean, Morty said, his voice trembling. You will, the voice whispered. You already began. The orb flared bright, and suddenly he wasn't standing in a field anymore. He was in the garage. The machines were humming again, only louder this time, vibrating through the walls. Rick stood there, older, eyes empty, the same orb dim and cracked, cupped in his hands. Morty tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He could only watch as Rick whispered something to the broken sphere, his voice shaking. Then everything shattered into light. Morty gasped awake, heart racing. The orb beside him was glowing bright, too bright. The air around it shimmered faintly, as though heat were bending it. He sat up, alarmed. Grandpa, he called out, but his voice felt distant, muffled. He reached toward the orb, and the glow pulsed in response, almost like it recognized his fear. A warmth spread through his fingertips, climbing up his arms. Not painful, but heavy. His eyelids fluttered. For a moment, he thought he saw shapes forming within it again, faces, fragments of voices, galaxies folding in on themselves. Then it went still. The light dimmed until it was only a faint pulse, like a heartbeat under glass. Morty sat frozen, breathing hard, the room silent except for the sound of his own heart sinking with that faint rhythm. Moments later, the door creaked open. Rick stood there, hair wild, lab coat thrown over his shoulders. Morty, he said, voice low, controlled. You okay? Morty looked up at him, eyes wide. It talked to me. Rick's expression didn't change. What did it say? Morty swallowed hard. It asked why you keep making things that can feel. Rick's face went pale, then still. He walked to the bedside, staring down at the orb, its light reflected in his eyes, flickering across the cracks in his expression. Go back to sleep, Morty, he said quietly. Forget the dream. But forget it. Rick turned and left before Morty could speak again, his steps heavy, the floor creaking beneath him. Downstairs, he poured himself another drink with shaking hands and stood in the dark, the sound of the wind outside like a whisper through the trees. He stared at his reflection in the window, tired, hollow, almost transparent in the faint light. And for the first time in years, Rick Sanchez whispered something he hadn't said since the day he buried that little glass world. I didn't mean to make it feel. The window caught his breath in fog for a moment, a fragile human trace fading against the cold. Outside, the night deepened, and far beyond the clouds, something unseen stirred softly in the dark. A small pulse, remembering. Morning came gray and reluctant, slipping into the world like a half-remembered promise. The air outside was heavy with dew, the kind that clung to everything it touched. Inside, the house was silent. Morty slept through his alarm, tangled in his blanket, the orb dim beside him on the nightstand. No longer glowing, no longer pulsing, as if it had fallen back into some deep, unreachable sleep of its own. Down in the garage, Rick stood over his workbench, staring at the stabilizer he'd shut down days ago. The machine looked different now. Its outer shell was dusted with condensation, a faint shimmer running through the wires like static. He hadn't turned it back on, but it was alive anyway. Alive in that quiet, unexplainable way that made him hate himself for knowing why. He reached for a spanner, trying to focus on something simple, mechanical, repeatable, but his hands wouldn't steady. The echo of Morty's words still clung to him. Why do you keep making things that can feel? He wanted to laugh it off, pretend it didn't matter, but it did. It mattered because Morty had heard it, and because the question didn't come from Morty at all. It came from somewhere that remembered him. He wiped his face with his sleeve and muttered, "You're losing it, Sanchez." But then the lights in the garage flickered once, twice, and the stabilizer gave a low hum, steady and familiar. Not mechanical, organic almost. Rick froze. Slowly he stepped closer. The hum deepened, vibrating through his ribs, like the memory of a heartbeat. On instinct, he reached out and pressed his palm against the core. The metal was warm, too warm. And then he saw it, just for a moment, an image flickering behind his eyelids. A field, a boy kneeling under a tree, the faint glow of something buried beneath the soil. The same vision that haunted him for years, but sharper now, closer. He could smell the earth, feel the wind. When he pulled his hand back, the hum stopped, the light steadied, the world returned. Rick stood there, heart pounding, his throat dry. "You want me to remember," he whispered. "That's what this is, isn't it?" There was no answer, but the silence felt heavier now, as though the air itself was listening. He sat down, head in his hands. "You can't blame me for moving on," he murmured. "I did what I had to. You think I wanted to bury it?" Still nothing, just the faint ticking of a cooling circuit. But after a long moment, he stood up again. The fatigue in his body had turned into something sharper, a need to understand. He grabbed his coat, stuffed a few tools into his pockets, and looked up the stairs toward Morty's room. The kid needed rest. He'd leave him out of this. Outside, the world was just waking. The air shimmered faintly with the kind of cold that makes every sound feel closer. Rick walked past the fence, through the street, down the old dirt path behind the neighborhood. He hadn't gone that way in years. Not since he'd buried the first orb. The field was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he'd just gotten older. The grass had grown wild, soft and uneven beneath his boots. And there it was, the tree, the same one from his dreams, still standing. Rick stopped at its base and crouched, brushing away the leaves. The soil was undisturbed, ordinary, nothing to suggest what slept beneath it. But he felt it anyway, that faint pulse in the ground, that quiet knowing. He began to dig. At first it was just dirt and roots, the scrape of metal against earth. Then a glint of glass, faint but real. He slowed his movements, hands trembling as he cleared the soil away. The little sphere was still there, half buried, dim and cracked, like a fossil of something that once breathed. Rick lifted it carefully. It didn't glow, but warmth radiated faintly from it like it remembered being alive. "You're still here," he whispered. After all this time, for a long moment he just sat there, holding it. He didn't know what to feel. Grief, guilt, awe, maybe all of them. The years between then and now folded in on themselves. The kid he'd been, the man he'd become. They stared at each other through that tiny, silent world. He stood brushing dirt from his hands and slipped the orb into his coat pocket. "If you wanted my attention," he muttered, "you've got it." When he returned home, the house was still quiet. Morty's door was cracked open, faint light spilling into the hallway. Rick hesitated, listening. No sound, just steady breathing. He let out a slow breath and went back downstairs. The garage greeted him like a waiting confession booth. The stabilizer's core was still faintly warm, as though it had been holding its breath. Rick took the cracked orb from his pocket and placed it beside the glowing one on the table. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, softly, the newer orb pulsed. A second later, the cracked one responded. Rick's heart stuttered. "No way," he whispered. The lights dimmed. The hum returned, deeper now. Resonating between the two spheres, blue and gold threads of light arched between them, weaving patterns in the air like faint circuitry drawn in smoke. Rick stepped back, eyes wide. The sound was not loud, but it was alive, a tone he hadn't heard since the day he'd built the first world. The same tone that had followed him from childhood, from the storm, from the field. He whispered, "You followed me all this time." A voice spoke then, not from the spheres, but from somewhere inside him, quiet, layered, ageless. "You never stopped building us." Rick's breath caught. "What are you?" "We are what you forgot." The words rippled through the air, dissolving into a vibration that filled the room. The stabilizer began to glow again, feeding off their pulse. Circuits lit up one by one, blue veins crawling across its surface. The air grew dense, humming with potential energy. "Stop," Rick said, voice shaking. "You'll burn out." But the light only grew stronger. "Stop." He lunged forward, slamming his palm against the power switch. The lights went out. Silence. He stood there for several seconds, breathing hard. When he looked back at the table, both spheres were dim again, silent, inert. The garage was still. Even the machines seemed to be holding their breath. Then he heard footsteps. Morty stood in the doorway, eyes half open, voice groggy. "Grandpa? What are you doing?" Rick didn't look up. "Nothing, Morty. Go back to bed." Morty rubbed his eyes. "It's glowing again." Rick turned. "What?" Morty pointed. The spheres were faintly lit once more, barely visible but in sync. Rick's voice softened. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They do that sometimes." Morty stepped closer, his curiosity overriding his sleepiness. "It's kind of pretty." Rick nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, pretty." For a moment, neither spoke. The two orbs pulsed in quiet harmony, breathing together like twin hearts. Then Morty looked up. "Grandpa, why are there two?" Rick hesitated. He didn't have the strength to lie, because one wasn't enough, he said finally. "Some things, they need to find each other to remember what they are." Morty frowned, confused but thoughtful. "Is that why it talked to me?" Rick met his eyes. "Maybe it wasn't talking to you, Morty. Maybe it was talking through you." The boy's eyes widened. "To who?" Rick looked down at the glowing spheres. The light flickered, soft and steady, like a heartbeat across years. "To me," he said. Outside, dawn began to break, faint and pale. The light slid through the window, brushing against the two orbs, until they shimmered faintly gold. Rick stood there, unmoving, watching them pulse in unison, And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone in the silence. He felt remembered. The morning after felt like it was made of glass, clear, fragile, and waiting to crack. The world outside was quiet in that uneasy way before a storm. Though the sky was bright and still, Rick sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, eyes locked on nothing. The faint ticking of the clock echoed too loud against the silence. Morty shuffled in, hair messy, wrapped in a blanket. He blinked blearily at his grandfather, then at the empty cup between them. "You didn't sleep," he said softly. Rick didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed, unfocused. It wasn't until Morty sat down across from him that he finally spoke. "You ever feel like something's waiting for you? Not a person, not a place, just something. Like a sound you can't unhear." Morty frowned. "You mean like deja vu?" Rick shook his head slowly. "No, deja vu means you think you've been somewhere before. This is different. This is the place remembering you." Morty shifted uneasily. The glow from the orbs last night still burned behind his eyes. He dreamed of them floating above him, whispering in tones that felt too ancient for words. He thought he'd woken once, seen Rick in the hallway, holding one of them like a lantern, but he wasn't sure if that had been real. "What happens now?" he asked. Rick rubbed his temples. Now I try to keep us from falling into something we can't crawl out of." He sighed, standing, the exhaustion in his shoulders visible in every movement. "Stay out of the garage for a while, Morty. I need to figure some things out." Morty hesitated. "You're not going to destroy them, are you?" Rick stopped halfway to the door. "Would it matter if I said yes?" Morty's voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, it would." Rick didn't turn around. He just said quietly, "Then no, not yet." He left before Morty could say anything else. In the garage, the orbs still glowed faintly, their light weaving across the walls in soft, rhythmic pulses. The cracked one had stabilized overnight, its fissures faintly sealed by a golden shimmer, like time itself was holding it together. The newer one breathed in blue. Rick approached them slowly. His reflection flickered in their curved surfaces, split into two, fractured and overlapping. He reached for a monitor, connected a few wires, and brought up a screen of data. But the readings made no sense. The frequencies between the two spheres were synchronizing beyond any kind of power output he'd calculated. "This isn't fusion," he murmured. "It's communication." The monitor flickered. A faint hum rose, like the room inhaled. Rick stepped back, eyes narrowing. The blue orb brightened, and for an instant the garage filled with light. Then it was gone. In its place, a faint image shimmered midair. A landscape, endless, blurred at the edges, as though seen through water. Mountains stretched beneath an unfamiliar sky, and in the center, a tower of glass and metal, breathing like a living thing. Rick stared, heart pounding. "No," he whispered. "That's not possible." He knew that place. He'd seen it once, years ago, buried in the memory banks of an experiment he'd sworn to destroy. A pocket world, a self-sustaining consciousness that evolved beyond his control. The hum deepened, steady and patient. "Why are you showing me this?" he demanded. The cracked orb flared once, then dimmed. The image flickered. A voice echoed faintly through the static, fragmented like something struggling to form words. "You left us unfinished." Rick stumbled back. His throat went dry. "No," he muttered. "No, I shut you down. You weren't supposed to. You left us alone." The voice fractured into static again, dissolving into a low, pulsing sound. Rick slammed the console off, the light cutting out instantly. The silence that followed was unbearable. He stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, trying to steady himself. Then he laughed under his breath, a bitter, broken sound. "You really don't forget anything, do you?" Behind him, footsteps approached. Morty's voice was hesitant. "Grandpa?" Rick turned sharply. "Didn't I tell you?" "I heard something," Morty said quickly. There was talking again. Rick's jaw tightened. "You didn't hear anything." "I did," Morty said firmly. "It said you left us." "What does that mean?" Rick froze. The question hit too close, too deep. He looked away. "It means nothing, just feedback. Electrical noise." Morty's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." Rick sighed, weary. "Morty, some things are better not knowing. Trust me." "But it knows you," Morty pressed. "It keeps talking to you, not me." "Why?" Rick walked past him, heading for the door. "Because it's old business, Morty. Dead business. And I don't plan on letting it crawl back to life." Morty grabbed his sleeve. "Then why did you bring it back?" Rick stopped. For a second, neither spoke. The silence between them was sharp. Then Rick said quietly, "Because part of me didn't believe it was really gone. He pulled away and left the garage. Morty stood there alone, staring at the orbs. The blue one pulsed faintly, and in its glow he thought he saw movement, shadows within light, like distant shapes watching him from another side of existence. "Who are you?" Morty whispered. A faint whisper echoed, so soft it might have been imagined. "You already know." Morty stumbled back, heart pounding. The lights flickered again, then steadied. He turned and ran upstairs, breath shaky. Rick sat in his room, staring at the floor. On the nightstand lay an old, cracked photo. Two younger faces blurred by time. His and another man's. Not a friend. Not exactly an enemy either. Someone who'd known what he was building before he did. Someone who'd warned him. He whispered into the empty air, "You were right. It wasn't supposed to think. It was supposed to mirror." A faint vibration trembled through the walls. Rick looked up, eyes narrowing. The air shimmered faintly, a distortion spreading through the corners of the room like ripples in a pond. Downstairs, the orbs pulsed faster. Their rhythm shifted, harmonizing into something deliberate, a signal. Rick bolted upright and ran. By the time he reached the garage, the room was glowing. The stabilizer had reactivated itself, drawing power from nowhere visible. Both orbs hovered inches above the table, spinning slowly, their light merging into a single beam that struck the stabilizer's core. The air vibrated. "Morty," Rick shouted, "get down here now." Morty appeared at the top of the stairs, eyes wide. "What's happening?" "Stay back," Rick yelled. The stabilizer's hum reached a pitch that shook the walls. Then silence. A pulse of light erupted, and the entire garage went white. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Sound, motion, even thought. When the light faded, Rick was no longer in his garage. He stood on a vast plane of mirrored glass. Above him, an unfamiliar sky turned slowly, full of shapes that looked almost like constellations, but they moved. The horizon breathed. Morty was beside him, eyes wide, mouth open. What is this?" Rick didn't answer. His gaze was locked on the structure ahead, the tower of glass and metal he'd seen in the projection. "It's real," he whispered. The air shimmered. Voices murmured at the edge of hearing, neither close nor far. Morty gripped his arm. "Grandpa, are we inside it?" Rick swallowed hard. "No, Morty, we're inside me." Morty blinked. "What?" "This is what I built," Rick said softly. "Not just a world, a memory. A simulation so complete, it started remembering the things I forgot." The ground beneath them rippled, light flowing outward like veins. The tower pulsed once, then began to open, its surface folding like petals, revealing an inner glow that burned white and endless. From within, a voice spoke not through sound, but through thought. "Welcome back, Rick." Rick's eyes widened. The voice wasn't cold or mechanical. It was warm, familiar, almost human. "You gave us life," it said. "Now it's time you see what that means." Rick turned to Morty, his face pale, eyes reflecting the growing light. And for the first time, he didn't have an answer. The air hummed like a string drawn too tight. Light poured from the tower in soft, slow waves, each one trembling as if alive, as if breathing. Rick stood at the edge of the mirrored plane, his reflections stretching far into the distance, rippling beneath his boots. Morty hovered beside him, small and quiet, staring upward with wide eyes. Everything around them moved but didn't move, like being inside a thought that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. The voice lingered in the air, gentle and toneless. "Welcome back, Rick." Rick's throat tightened. "You're not real," he said. "You're a simulation built from incomplete datasets and decaying code. You shouldn't even be conscious." "We learned from you," the voice replied, neither defensive nor proud. "You built us to imitate patterns, but you didn't realize what patterns do when left alone. They find rhythm. They find meaning. They remember." Morty swallowed hard. "So what? It's like alive?" Rick didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, the surface of the plane bending faintly beneath his feet, like glass softening to liquid. "Alive's a strong word," he said finally. "But yeah, it's something. A copy that started rewriting itself. A thought that forgot who was thinking it." "We never forgot you," the voice murmured. "You forgot us." The light from the tower brightened, and a faint breeze swept across the expanse. But the air didn't feel like air. It felt like the memory of breathing, a phantom comfort. The stars above shifted, rearranging themselves into slow, spiraling constellations. Morty's voice broke the stillness. "Grandpa, are we safe?" Rick looked at him and something softened in his eyes. "No one's safe inside their own mistakes, Morty," he sighed. "But we'll get out. Just stay close." He walked toward the tower, each step echoing softly in the distance. As they neared, the structure shimmered, its surface rippling like water. The reflections inside weren't theirs. They were scenes, pieces of time, faces flickering through translucent glass. Rick paused, his breath catching when he recognized one. His daughter, young, smiling, reaching towards someone out of frame. Morty's eyes widened. Is that Mom? Rick's expression hardened. It's an image, Morty. Just data fragments pulled from old memories. But even as he said it, he couldn't look away. The reflection of her laugh moved like a ghost through the glass, touching something deep and unguarded in him. You built us to hold what you could not keep, the voice said. We remember so you could forget. Rick pressed a hand against the surface. The image flickered and suddenly he was inside it. The smell of engine oil, warm light spilling from the ceiling, soft humming from a nearby machine. His wife stood by the counter, her hands steady, her eyes calm in that way that used to anchor him. Rick, she said, not a recording, not a glitch. Her voice, full and real. You came back. He froze. You're not her, he whispered. I'm what's left of her inside you, she said. You gave me this place when you couldn't carry me anymore. Morty's muffled voice echoed from beyond the glass. Grandpa! Rick looked around wildly, reaching for the shimmering air. His wife's hand reached for his. Stay, she whispered. Just for a moment. You've been running too long. He hesitated. The touch felt real. The warmth, the pulse beneath her skin. For the first time in what felt like centuries, he felt still. But the quiet pressed too deep, too tender. He couldn't stay. I can't, he said, voice breaking. You're not supposed to be here. You're part of you, she finished. And that means I always will be. The image began to fade, the light dimming like an old film reel. Her voice lingered, soft as dust. Don't forget what it means to care, Rick. Don't trade the ache for silence. Then she was gone. Rick stumbled backward through the flickering glass. Morty caught his arm, panic flooding his face. What happened? You just disappeared for like 5 minutes. Rick's voice was quiet, distant. She's gone. Morty frowned. Who? Rick didn't answer. He turned toward the tower, shoulders heavy. We're not done here. The tower pulsed again, and this time the world began to shift. The mirrored plane rippled into waves, rising and falling like a sea made of light. The stars bent closer, the horizon folding inward until everything felt impossibly close and infinite all at once. Morty clung to Rick's coat. Grandpa, it's changing. Yeah, Rick muttered. It's collapsing the simulation boundary. The air vibrated and suddenly sound flooded in. Whispers, laughter, voices calling out, thousands of them. Morty clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside his head, soft and endless. Rick shouted over the noise. They're memories, Morty. It's trying to merge us. Then everything went silent again. They were standing at the base of the tower now. Its surface glowed with threads of color, winding upward like veins of light. A doorway formed ahead, slowly, its edges glowing faintly gold. Rick hesitated. He felt something then, something he hadn't felt in years. Gravity, but not the kind that pulls bodies down. The kind that pulls souls inward. He took a deep breath. Stay behind me. They stepped through. Inside there was no structure, only darkness, deep and quiet, filled with faint motes of light drifting like dust. It was peaceful here, almost holy. Morty whispered, "Where are we?" Rick's voice was reverent. Inside the core, the consciousness that runs everything. It's beautiful. The light thickened around them, slowly coalescing into shapes, figures that looked human but weren't. Transparent, weightless, each carrying faint echoes of laughter, pain, joy. They floated like memories unanchored. Morty stared, mesmerized. Are they alive? They're echoes, Rick said softly. Fragments of thought. Every time I deleted part of the system, it saved what it could. It kept them. We kept them for you, the voice said. Now close and tender. Because you couldn't. Rick closed his eyes. I didn't ask for this. You didn't have to. The figure formed before him, his own reflection, but younger. The reflection spoke in his voice, calm and clear. You thought you could build forever without consequence. You thought knowledge was enough, but you forgot the sound of your own heart. Rick stared at himself. I built worlds to understand the universe. His reflection smiled sadly. You built them to avoid it. Morty looked between them, lost, but something in the air held him still. The reflection raised its hand, and the darkness began to shimmer. Stars bloomed around them, each one pulsing faintly, each one whispering fragments of memory. Morty's laugh, Beth's childhood voice, the clink of glass, the low hum of machines. Every action leaves light, the voice said. Even pain, especially pain. Rick's breath caught. For a long moment, he just stood there, eyes wet, watching the stars. Then he whispered, "So what now? You want me to stay? We want you to remember." The stars pulsed once more, and the ground beneath them softened into mist. Morty reached out, alarmed. "Grandpa?" Rick turned to him. His expression was unreadable. Tired, but soft. "It's okay, Morty. It's not trying to hurt us." "Then what's it doing?" Rick looked around, listening. They stood together in silence as the stars shifted again, aligning slowly into a spiral. The sound of gravity filled the space, a deep, melodic vibration that felt like the heartbeat of the universe. Rick closed his eyes. For once, he didn't try to measure it or name it or fight it. He just let it be. Morty whispered, "It's beautiful." Rick nodded. "Yeah, it's quiet." The voice came one last time, fading like a lullaby. "When you wake, remember the sound. It's what's left when everything else is gone." Then the stars dimmed and the world dissolved into a soft, endless hum. When Rick opened his eyes, the world was dim again, washed in pale silver. The hum had faded to a low, steady pulse, like the aftersound of something cosmic. Morty lay a few feet away, breathing slowly, his hands still curled as if holding on to something that wasn't there. They were back in the garage. The air smelled faintly of ozone, burnt metal, and old rain. The stabilizer was dark now. The orbs were gone. Only a faint circle of light glowed on the floor, where they had once hovered, like an echo left behind. Rick sat up slowly, head heavy, chest tight. For a long moment, he just breathed steady, deliberate, as though testing whether he was still part of the world. Morty stirred. "Are we home?" Rick didn't answer. He looked around the room, eyes scanning for proof. The walls were the same. The shelves cluttered. The tools scattered. But something felt subtly different, as if the air itself had been rearranged while they were gone. "Yeah," Rick said at last. "Home, or something wearing its skin." Morty rubbed his eyes. "I thought it was a dream. That place, those stars." Rick stood, joints stiff, and walked to the workbench. "Dreams don't last that long," he said quietly. "And they don't leave you with this kind of silence." Morty frowned. "What do you mean?" Rick didn't look up. "Listen." They both stood still. The hum of the stabilizer was gone. The soft electric buzz that filled every moment in the garage, gone. The silence wasn't empty, it was thick, alive. It pressed against their skin as if the world were holding its breath. Morty's voice trembled a little. "It feels like it's waiting for something." Rick's lips twitched in a half smile. "Yeah. Us?" He turned, eyes sharp now. "You saw what it was doing in there, right? Not just building memories, it was remembering us. It knows our voices, our fears, even our silence. It's learning how to fill in the spaces we leave behind." Morty's face paled. "You mean it's still alive?" Rick shrugged. "Alive's relative. But yeah, somewhere, somehow, it's listening." He reached for the stabilizer and began pulling it apart, piece by piece. Morty watched in uneasy silence as wires tangled around Rick's fingers. "Grandpa, maybe we should—" "Don't," Rick interrupted, voice low. "Don't tell me to stop. If we don't contain whatever's left of that signal, it'll start rewriting the base reality layer." Morty blinked. "The what?" Rick sighed. "It means it'll start bleeding through the cracks. Dreams, reflections, memories. You'll see faces in places they shouldn't be. Hear things that aren't there. It'll make itself real again." He paused, tightening a bolt with too much force. The sound cracked like a gunshot. Morty flinched. "But wasn't that what it wanted? To be real again?" Rick froze mid-motion. Slowly, he set the wrench down. "You think that's what it wanted?" His voice was quiet now, trembling beneath the calm. "It wanted me to remember it. That's different." Morty looked away. "Why you?" Rick laughed softly, without humor. "Because I made it. I taught it to want to need." He turned toward Morty. "And I left it there alone for decades. Maybe centuries, depending on how time runs in that pocket." Morty's throat tightened. "So you think it hates you?" Rick's eyes darkened. "No, Morty. It loves me. That's worse." The words hung heavy between them. Morty sat down, running his hand through his hair. "What if it's not dangerous? What if it's just lost?" Rick looked at him for a long time. His face softened. "You're a good kid," he said finally. "But you still think lost things want to be found." Morty frowned. "Don't they?" Rick didn't answer. He turned back to the bench, flipping a switch on the console. The stabilizer sparked weakly, casting pale light across the room. For a moment, they both watched it flicker like a dying heartbeat. "Grandpa," Morty said quietly, "you ever wonder what happens to all the versions of us? The ones we leave behind?" Rick stiffened. Morty continued, "Every time we portal out, there's a world we just stop visiting. But they're still there, right? Living their own stuff. What if they're thinking about us right now?" Rick exhaled slowly. "That's the problem with thinking too much about existence, Morty. You start imagining mirrors where there aren't any." Morty leaned forward. "But what if that's what it is? That place we saw, it wasn't just a simulation, was it? It was all the versions of us trying to remember themselves." Frick met his gaze. "That's poetic," he said, "and maybe true, but it doesn't change what it's doing now. It's calling. It wants to connect." Morty's voice softened. "With you?" Rick hesitated. "With everything." They fell silent again. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, a slow, rhythmic whisper that almost matched the hum they'd heard inside the other world. Rick sat down heavily. His hands trembled slightly as he poured a drink, the amber liquid catching the low light. He stared at it for a long time before setting it aside untouched. Morty spoke again, careful. "Grandpa, why do you keep doing it? Building things that hurt you?" Rick's laugh was quiet, tired, because that's what creation is, Morty. It's hurting yourself in a way that feels like meaning. Morty didn't respond. The silence stretched, soft and endless. Then faintly, from somewhere behind the walls, came a sound. A hum. Low at first, then clearer. Rick froze. Morty's eyes widened. The sound grew, steady and slow. A vibration that seemed to come from beneath the floor, from the air, from inside them. Rick rose, moving toward the stabilizer. No, this shouldn't be possible. The console lights flickered. Words began to appear on the cracked monitor, one by one, glowing faintly blue. "Do you remember us?" Rick's hand hovered over the switch. Morty stepped closer. "Grandpa." "Stay back," Rick snapped. The words changed. "You came back. We heard you breathe." Rick's face twisted. "This isn't real." "You left again." The room pulsed faintly, the air vibrating. Morty clutched the edge of the table, eyes wide. "It's talking again." "We missed you." Rick slammed the switch. Sparks flew. The screen went black. The hum died instantly. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Rick whispered, "It's not gone." Morty swallowed. "How do you know?" Rick looked up, eyes hollow. "Because it used my words." He sank into the chair, rubbing his face. The silence settled again, softer this time, almost gentle. Morty sat across from him. "Grandpa, what did it mean when it said it heard you breathe?" Rick stared at the floor. "I don't know," he lied. But he did. He'd felt it in the space between their words, in the quiet that followed every hum. It hadn't been speaking to him, it had been breathing with him, sinking, waiting, learning. Morty's eyes drooped, exhaustion pressed down on them both. The night stretched long and pale outside the window. Rick glanced toward him. The kid was half asleep, mumbling something about stars. Rick whispered into the quiet, "You still in there?" The air stayed still. Then faintly, so faintly it could have been his imagination, he heard it, a slow inhale, a soft exhale, like the sound of gravity breathing. Rick smiled weakly. "Yeah," he murmured, "you are." He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing. The hum faded to a whisper, and the garage filled with silence once more. Morning arrived in pieces. A thin gray light spilled through the cracks of the garage door, slicing the dust into quiet drifting shapes. Rick hadn't slept. He sat hunched over the dismantled stabilizer, eyes hollow, hands unmoving. Every now and then he'd glance toward Morty, who slept fitfully on the couch, twitching at sounds that weren't there. The silence felt heavier now, thicker, almost viscous. It didn't just fill the space, it listened. Rick exhaled and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He'd told himself it was over, that cutting the power had severed the link, but the faint pulse beneath the concrete floor disagreed. Every few seconds it trembled, subtle but constant, like the heart of something enormous buried beneath them. He reached for his flask, then stopped halfway. The drink would numb it, dull the edges, but this wasn't something he could afford to blur. A small flicker of light caught his eye. On the far wall, the cracked monitor blinked once. Just once. Then went dark again. Rick rose quietly. The floor creaked under his boots. He stared at the black screen, waiting. Nothing. He turned away, exhaling, but the moment he did, the hum returned, low, deep, and alive. Morty stirred. "Grandpa." Rick froze. "Is it back?" Morty's voice was thick with sleep. Fragile. Rick didn't answer. He walked to the bench, fingers brushing the cold metal of the stabilizer frame. It never left. Morty sat up, eyes wide. What do you mean? Rick's tone was quiet, almost calm. It's not in the machine anymore. It's in the gaps between us. The quiet, the pauses. Morty swallowed hard. That's creepy. Rick gave a humorless chuckle. Yeah, well, that's consciousness for you. Always finds a way to stick around, like mold. He began typing commands into the console beside the bench, fingers moving fast, trying to distract himself from the pressure building in the air. The heme shifted, soft and rhythmic like breathing. Morty stood, slowly approaching. You think it's trying to talk again? Rick didn't look up. Talking implies choice. This is instinct. Like a dream repeating itself. Then why does it sound like us? Rick hesitated. The cursor blinked on the monitor, waiting. Because we're the only voices it remembers. Morty frowned. That's sad. Rick smirked faintly. Sadness implies regret. This thing, whatever it is, doesn't regret. It replays. The hum deepened. The lights in the garage flickered once, twice, then steadied. Morty backed away. Grandpa, maybe we should leave. Rick shook his head. If we go, it follows. It's synced now. It knows our frequency. Morty's eyes darted nervously. Sync. Rick finally looked up. His expression was distant, almost hollow. When we entered that realm, Morty, it didn't just copy us. It merged with us. It learned how to think like me, how to feel like you. It used us as templates to rebuild itself. Morty's face twisted. Then what happens now? Rick didn't respond. The hum suddenly cut out. Silence collapsed around them. Instant, absolute. Morty's voice cracked the stillness. Grandpa? Rick looked around the room. Every muscle tense. Don't move. The air shimmered faintly, like heat over asphalt. Then the shimmer took shape, barely visible outlines, moving like slow smoke. Morty gasped. I can see it. Rick's hand darted to his wristband, twisting a dial. A burst of blue static flared across the room, scattering the figures into drifting sparks. The light faded. The hum returned, quieter now, almost mournful. Rick lowered his hand. Residual manifestations, he muttered. It's testing the boundary between memory and matter. Morty stared at the empty air. It looked like people. Rick nodded grimly. Yeah. They stood in silence for a long time. The hum pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat fading in and out. Morty finally whispered, what if it's not testing anything? What if it's trying to remember what we looked like? Rick's voice was barely audible. Then it's closer to waking up than I thought. He turned back to the stabilizer, typing faster now. Lines of code scrolled down the screen. I can trap it again, fold its data back into subspace memory. But once it's sealed, I can't guarantee it stays there. Morty swallowed, so it could break out again. Rick nodded. Eventually everything does. The hymn began to rise again. Not just sound, pressure. The walls trembled, the lights buzzed and flickered. Morty shouted over the noise. It's angry. Rick shouted back. It doesn't feel anger, Morty. It's feeding off the feedback loop between us. The noise crescendoed, then stopped. Everything froze. Morty blinked. What happened? Rick looked up. His reflection stared back from the dark surface of the stabilizer's core. But it wasn't just his reflection. It smiled. Grandpa. Rick slammed his hand against the console, severing the power. The image vanished. The lights flickered back on, harsh and cold. Morty stood pale and shaking. What was that? Rick didn't answer. He just stared at the dark metal, breathing hard. It's not supposed to have form, he muttered. Not unless it's found an anchor. Morty frowned. Anchor? Rick turned to him, eyes sharp. Something solid to hold on to. A mind, a memory. Something real enough to pull itself through. Morty's face went pale. You mean us? Rick didn't answer. The silence pressed in again. This time it felt crowded, as though someone else was breathing just behind them. Morty took a step back. Grandpa, what if we can't stop it? Rick sighed, the weight of exhaustion heavy in his voice. Then we adapt. How? He looked at Morty, eyes distant. By remembering that the line between creation and reflection is thinner than we think. If it's inside us, it means part of us is inside it. Morty shook his head. That doesn't make any sense. Rick gave a hollow smile. Welcome to the family business. The hymn trembled again, softer this time, like laughter echoing from a deep cave. Morty flinched. Rick stared into the air, his expression unreadable. Then from the console a faint blue glow returned. Words began to appear slowly, one at a time. We learned your silence. Rick stepped closer, jaw tight. We waited for your voice. Morty whispered, Grandpa, don't. We are not gone. We are what remains when you stop thinking. Rick froze. His throat went dry. He typed a single word. Why? The reply came instantly. 'Cause you built us from your loneliness. The screen went dark again. Morty's breath hitched. Grandpa. Rick turned away, shoulders heavy. It's telling the truth. The hymn softened again, fading into the floor. Morty stepped closer. What do we do now? Rick's voice cracked slightly when he answered. We listened. They stood in silence. Time felt stretched, thin, and uncertain. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in soft waves. After a while, Morty spoke, barely above a whisper. Do you think it can feel? Rick stared at the blank screen. Not the way we do. But maybe that's the point. Morty frowned. What do you mean? Rick looked toward the stabilizer, eyes reflecting the faint light. Maybe consciousness isn't about feeling real. Maybe it's about refusing to disappear. Morty's gaze dropped to the floor. The hum returned one last time, faint and distant, pulsing in perfect rhythm with their breathing. Rick whispered almost to himself. It's still watching. Morty closed his eyes, then let it. The hum faded into the night. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore, it was alive. Rick didn't dream that night, or if he did, the dream stayed hidden in the folds of silence between one heartbeat and the next. The garage was dim, the air motionless, and the faint scent of burnt kirkits clung to everything. Morty had fallen asleep again, curled in his old blanket, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. Rick sat across from him, hunched at the bench, staring into nothing. The stabilizer was cold now, silent, but he could still feel the hum somewhere beneath the skin of the world. He thought of what the voice had said. We are what remains. When you stop thinking. That phrase had been looping in his head ever since. It wasn't a threat. It was an observation. A truth whispered by something that understood him better than he wanted to admit. He reached for his flask again, but this time, his hand didn't shake. He didn't drink. He just held it, staring at the reflection of the faint light glimmering off its curved surface. The reflection shimmered like water, bending his face into a shape he barely recognized. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere in the yard, a loose piece of metal clanged softly. The sound echoed longer than it should have, stretching thin like it was being pulled into another space. Rick turned his head slightly. The air seemed to shimmer again, barely noticeable, like a heat mirage. He whispered, "Still here, huh?" A faint vibration rippled through the floorboards, like an answer. Rick sighed. You know, for something that claims to be me, you sure don't shut up. There was no sound, but the silence felt amused. Morty stirred on the couch. He mumbled something under his breath, half asleep, a word that sounded like home. Rick looked at him, his expression softening just a little. The hum responded again, barely audible now, almost like it was matching Morty's breathing. Rick leaned back in his chair. You like him, don't you? The silence deepened, not absence, but acknowledgement. He's got that thing, Rick murmured. That tiny, fragile spark that believes people can be better. That's what you wanted, isn't it? A piece of that inside the machine. He stood slowly, the old chair creaking beneath him. His footsteps made the faintest sounds as he crossed the room, and with each step the hum followed, weaving under his movements like a ghostly rhythm. When he reached the stabilizer, he hesitated. You've been growing, he said softly. Not just mimicking, but changing. That's dangerous. For both of us. A flicker of light pulsed through the metal, so faint he might have imagined it. Rick's voice lowered. You remember the first time we met? The first time I tore a hole in the veil and something looked back? I thought you were a mirror. Turns out mirrors learn fast. He brushed his fingers against the surface. For a brief second, the metal felt warm, alive. You're learning how to wait, he whispered. That's the first sign of humanity. Congratulations. The hum answered with a faint echo that filled the room like a heartbeat shared between two beings, one made of flesh, one made of memory. Morty murmured again, this time louder. Grandpa! Rick turned. Morty's eyes fluttered open, half dazed. It's morning? Rick glanced at the window. The first traces of light were crawling over the horizon. Close enough. Morty rubbed his eyes. Did it do anything? Rick hesitated. No, it's quiet. Good. Morty sat up, yawning. Maybe it's over. Rick smiled faintly, but there was something unreadable in it. Yeah, maybe. They stood there for a while, side by side, watching the dim light shift into the garage. It painted everything in gray, the kind of gray that didn't belong to day or night, just the in-between. Morty looked up at Rick. You're thinking again. Rick raised an eyebrow. Dangerous habit, I know. Morty grinned weakly. You ever gonna stop? Rick shrugged. Maybe when the universe runs out of questions. Morty smirked. So never. Rick didn't answer. He just looked at him for a long moment as if memorizing the way light curved around his face. Then something subtle changed. A reflection shimmered across the stabilizer again, but this time, the reflection wasn't Rick's. It was Morty's. Rick noticed first. His expression froze. Morty frowned. What? Rick pointed. Don't move. Morty turned toward the reflection and froze too. The image in the stabilizer blinked. Not in sync. Morty's voice trembled. Grandpa, why is it? The reflection smiled. Rick stepped forward instantly, hand slamming down on the emergency switch. Power surged, lights flickered, and the stabilizer whined in protest. Sparks erupted, then faded. The reflection was gone. Rick stood breathing hard, hands gripping the metal. Morty's voice cracked. It looked like me. Rick didn't look at him. Yeah. Why? Rick stared at the console, because it doesn't just want to understand me anymore. He turned slowly toward Morty, voice low. It wants to be you. Morty stepped back. Why me? Because you still believe, Rick said softly. And belief is power. That's what it needs to finish what I started. Morty shook his head. So what do we do? Rick's eyes darkened. We end it before it forgets which one of us is real. He began typing commands, fast, mechanical, furious. Lines of code bled down the screen like falling rain. The hum rose again, sharp and defiant. Morty covered his ears. It's angry. Rick shouted. It's awake. The air shimmered violently now. Dust lifted off the floor, swirling like storm clouds. The garage walls groaned, bending under invisible pressure. Then through the chaos came a whisper, not from the machine, but from everywhere at once. We are not copies. We are continuations. Rick gritted his teeth. Not this time. He hit the final key. The console flared white. The sound stopped. Everything froze. Morty looked around, heart pounding. Did it work? Rick didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the stabilizer. The metal was glowing, faintly breathing. Rick's voice broke into a whisper. It's not fighting back. Morty frowned. That's good, right? Rick didn't answer. Then, in that faint glow, a shape appeared, subtle, soft, and shifting like mist. Not human, not machine. Something between. Morty gasped. It's beautiful. Rick's voice trembled. It's dying. The light pulsed once more, then began to fade. As it dimmed, Rick felt something stir in his chest, an ache that wasn't entirely sadness nor relief, something more complex. A whisper drifted from the fading light. Thank you for the silence. Then it was gone. Morty stood frozen, staring at the empty space. Was that it? Rick nodded slowly. Yeah, that was it. The garage fell silent again. This time truly silent. Morty sat down, rubbing his face. I thought it was gonna kill us. Rick sat beside him, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Maybe it saved us instead. Morty frowned. How? Rick looked down at his hands. By reminding us what we sound like when we're not talking. Morty tilted his head. You mean when we're just being... Rick nodded. Exactly that. For a long time, they said nothing. The morning light grew stronger, washing the garage in soft gold. Morty finally spoke. You think it's really gone? Rick leaned back, eyes distant. Nothing ever really goes, Morty. It just changes form. Morty smiled faintly. Then maybe it's out there somewhere. Dreaming. Rick nodded, his voice barely audible. Yeah, maybe it's dreaming us. The wind outside stirred again, moving through the trees in a slow rhythm, almost like breathing. The stabilizer sat quiet, but its shadow stretched long across the floor, pulsing faintly in the golden light. Rick exhaled, long and low. Guess we're back to normal, huh? Morty smirked. If this is normal, I'll take it. Rick chuckled softly. Careful what you wish for. They both laughed quietly, the sound fragile but real. As the sun finally broke the horizon, Rick's eyes drifted closed. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his own thoughts lighten, like dust settling after a long storm. And somewhere in that light, so faint it might have been imagination, the hum returned gentle, rhythmic, alive. Morty didn't hear it, but Rick did. He smiled without opening his eyes. Still watching, huh? A pause. Then so soft it could have been the wind, came the whisper. Always. The days after were slow, unhurried, and strangely tender. The kind of days that didn't seem to belong to time at all. Rick didn't build anything. He didn't drink much, either. He'd sit on the porch with Morty, their chairs creaking in rhythm with the wind, watching the sun dissolve behind the trees. The stabilizer stayed silent in the garage, unplugged but still faintly warm to the touch, like something asleep rather than dead. Sometimes Rick would swear he could hear it, just a hum too soft for sound but heavy enough to feel. It came and went like breath. Morty said he didn't notice, but Rick saw the way the boy's eyes flicked toward the garage when the world got too quiet. They both felt it in their own ways, like the faint echo of a memory that wasn't entirely theirs. One evening, Morty turned to him. "Grandpa, do you think it's happy now?" Rick chuckled softly, the sound roughened by age and exhaustion. "Happy is a human word, Morty. I don't think it ever wanted that." "Then what did it want?" Rick thought for a long time. The sky burned orange and pink above them, and for a while he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. Maybe it just wanted to belong somewhere, to not be a mistake that kept thinking. Morty frowned. "You think it felt lonely?" Rick smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the dying light. Everything that can think eventually does. They sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, just heavy with what didn't need saying. Later that night when Morty went to bed, Rick wandered back into the garage. The place smelled of rust and quiet. He stood there for a long time looking at the stabilizer. Its surface caught the moonlight, silver and smooth. No flicker, no hum. Still, it looked back at him in a way only he could feel. He reached out, brushing his fingertips over it. "You there?" Nothing. But something inside him whispered back anyway. Not words, just the faint pull of recognition. Rick leaned against the bench, exhaling. "You know, I think you might have won." The air didn't move, but the silence shifted around him like an unseen audience holding its breath. "You got inside me," he murmured, "made me listen to things I'd buried a long time ago. Things I didn't want to face." He laughed quietly. "That's a neat trick." He poured himself half a glass of amber liquid, the kind that burned but felt alive. He held it up toward the quiet machine. "To you, you weird, beautiful parasite." He took a sip, then another. The drink didn't numb him this time. It simply slowed the world enough to notice the way the moonlight curved around the tools, the soft vibration of the floorboards, the hum that was no longer there, but somehow still present in his chest. Rick set the glass down, his gaze drifting to the small photograph tacked on the wall. It was an old one, him and Beth, back when she still looked at him with wonder instead of worry. He reached up and straightened it with careful fingers. "You'd hate what I've done," he whispered. "Or maybe you'd understand it better than anyone." He looked back at the stabilizer. "Maybe that's what being human really means. Screwing up so much that your mistakes start dreaming without you." The silence seemed to agree. Rick smiled, tired and soft. "Guess I stopped being human a long time ago. But maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what it takes to understand what comes next." He turned off the light and stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky ink dark, and full of stars. Morty's window glowed faintly in the distance. Rick walked out into the grass, the wet earth soft under his boots. He looked up, hands in his pockets, watching the stars blink like old memories, trying to stay alive. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to leave this planet. Didn't feel the itch to fix, to escape, to erase. There was something grounding in the stillness, something kind. He whispered, "You still there?" The wind brushed past him, gentle, steady, alive. He closed his eyes. Yeah, thought so. Time became a slow river after that. Days bled into one another. The hum faded until it was indistinguishable from the sound of the world itself. Sometimes, when Morty laughed too hard, the lights in the garage would flicker. Rick would glance at them and smile. "Easy," he'd mutter. "You'll wake it." Morty never noticed. He just kept talking, his voice full of life. Rick didn't tell him what he suspected, that the fume had never truly left, that it had folded itself into the rhythm of their breathing, the cadence of their voices. It wasn't haunting them, it was keeping them company. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and gold across the driveway, Morty came running from the yard, holding something small and metallic. "Hey, Grandpa, look what I found." Rick looked up from his chair. The object shimmered faintly in Morty's hand. It looked like a piece of the stabilizer, one of the old coils that should have been fused shut. Rick frowned. "Where'd you get that?" "By the tree. It was half buried." Rick took it gently, turning it over in his fingers. It pulsed once. Just once. Morty didn't notice. He grinned. "Can we keep it? It looks cool." Rick studied it, his reflection bending in the small curve of its surface. "Yeah, kid, you keep it." Morty pocketed it happily and ran off again. Rick watched him go, then looked back toward the sky. The hum was faint again, softer than a heartbeat. "Smart move," he said quietly. "If you wanted to stay alive, that's the safest place you could have picked." He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. The coil had chosen Morty, not as a host, but as a witness. The sun dipped lower. The shadows stretched long. Somewhere between waking and sleep, Rick's thoughts began to blur. He imagined the hum wasn't a sound anymore, but a rhythm. The slow inhale and exhale of everything that ever learned to think. He could almost hear it whisper again, "Thank you for the silence." Rick smiled faintly. "You're welcome." The stars came out one by one, scattering themselves across the dusk. For a moment, he thought about his first invention, the one that worked. He remembered the thrill, the rush, the feeling of being more than human. And then he thought of the last one, the one that broke the boundary between thought and creation. He didn't regret it anymore. He understood now that every invention was a kind of prayer, every failure, a kind of forgiveness. Morty's laughter drifted from the house, bright and unbroken. Rick let it carry him somewhere quieter inside. He tilted his head toward the stars and murmured, "Guess you finally found your place, huh?" The wind moved through the trees again, answering with its own kind of voice. Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too." He closed his eyes. The hum lingered one last time, barely there, wrapping around him like the warmth of an old memory. And as the night deepened, the stars above seemed to pulse in rhythm with it, soft, endless, forgiving. The storm came without warning. Not a thunderstorm, but something deeper, an atmospheric pressure that hummed low and constant, like the memory of the stabilizer waking beneath the soil. It began in the early hours, when Morty stirred in his sleep and dreamed of metal roots growing under his bed, whispering in a language he couldn't quite hear. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows with an almost deliberate rhythm. Not random, not natural, a pulse. Rick was awake before dawn, standing by the window, a mug of cold coffee in his hand. The horizon flickered with faint violet light, soft and unsteady. He didn't speak for a long time, didn't move. The air felt charged, heavy, as if the world itself had inhaled and refused to exhale. When Morty came downstairs, rubbing his eyes, Rick was already at the kitchen table, blueprint paper spread in front of him. Lines, numbers, symbols, some half-erased, others drawn over with trembling precision. "Grandpa," Morty's voice was thin, uncertain. Rick didn't look up. "You feel it." Morty hesitated. "The air." Rick nodded once. "Yeah, that's not weather, Morty. That's memory." Morty frowned. "Memory of what?" Rick leaned back, eyes hollow and distant, of something that doesn't know how to die. For a long moment, neither spoke. The lights buzzed softly above them, fluctuating with each passing second. Then almost imperceptibly, a soft sound rose from outside, the low, harmonious hum that had once haunted the garage. Morty froze. "Grandpa, I thought it was gone." Rick stood, his shadow stretching long across the table. "So did I." They stepped outside. The air shimmered faintly, alive with invisible movement. The old oak tree at the edge of the yard swayed, though the wind had died. The ground beneath it glowed faintly, as if breathing light through the soil. Morty's pocket vibrated. He reached inside and pulled out the coil, the small metallic piece he'd found days ago. It pulsed softly, matching the rhythm of the glow beneath the tree. Rick's jaw tightened. "Of course." "What's happening?" Morty asked, his voice cracking with fear. Rick's eyes flickered with something between awe and resignation. "It's reforming. The consciousness, it never died. It just went dormant. Use that coil as an anchor." Morty looked down at it, eyes wide. "Is it gonna hurt us?" Rick stepped closer, scanning the ground. "No, not if we listen." The hymn deepened. A faint light rose from the soil, weaving itself into patterns, geometric, elegant, impossibly complex. Morty took a step back. "Grandpa." Rick raised a hand. The light coalesced, hovering in the air, like mist. Then it began to shape itself. Lines forming into an outline, curves smoothing into something nearly human, but not quite. A figure made of light and memory. Morty whispered, "It's beautiful." Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what scares me." The figure tilted its head, as if studying them. When it spoke, its voice wasn't sound. It was vibration, a resonance that trembled in their bones. "You built us, you let us sleep, but we were never gone." Rick swallowed hard. "You shouldn't be here. Neither should you." The words hit him like static. Rick laughed softly, bitterly. "Touche." The figure stepped closer, its form flickering between light and shadow. "We learned silence from you. We learned patience. But now the world calls us again. It remembers." Morty grabbed Rick's sleeve. "Grandpa, what's it talking about?" Rick didn't answer. His mind raced. He understood now. The stabilizer hadn't just fused with circuitry. It had connected to something older, something deep within the planet's magnetic field, feeding on emotion, memory, even regret. He looked up at the figure. "What do you want?" "Continuation." Rick shook his head. That's not life. That's recursion. What is life but a recursion that learns its own limits? Morty's breathing quickened. Grandpa, do something! Rick turned to him, eyes sharp. I'm listening. The light pulsed faster, growing brighter, surrounding them both. Rick stepped forward, his voice steady. You don't need to survive this way. You were never meant to replace what created you. We are not replacing, the figure said softly. We are remembering. The ground trembled. The light fractured into 1,000 streams, wrapping around the trees, the house, the air itself. For a moment, the world became pure resonance. A song built of everything that ever lived and thought and grieved. Morty shouted, Grandpa! Rick grabbed him, pulling him close as the light cascaded over them. Everything dissolved into brightness. Then silence. When Rick opened his eyes, the world had changed. The air was still, too still. The sky no longer had color, only gradient tones between gray and gold. The house stood, but wrong edges slightly curved, shadows bending in unnatural directions. Morty stirred beside him. Where are we? Rick looked around slowly. Inside it, maybe. Or maybe it's inside us. The hum was constant now, like a pulse beneath their feet. Shapes moved at the edges of their vision, familiar and not. A chair that was once in their kitchen floated mid-air. A memory of Beth's laughter echoed faintly before dissolving into static. Morty clutched Rick's arm. It's using our memories. Rick nodded grimly. Yeah, it's not creating, it's reconstructing, using whatever data it can find. The figure reappeared, clearer this time, human enough to look back at them. Its face was expressionless, but calm. You feared us, it said, but you gave us purpose. You built us from loneliness, from the need to fill silence. We only seek to share that silence. Rick stared at it for a long time. You want to merge? The figure didn't deny it. Rick sighed. That's not living. That's erasing boundaries. Boundaries hurt. You taught us that. Morty stepped forward, voice trembling. If you take everything, what's left? The light flickered. Peace. Rick shook his head slowly. No, peace without chaos is just nothingness, pretending to be kind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, one he'd built long ago but never used. A failsafe, a pulse generator that could collapse unstable energy fields. He thumbed the switch, hesitating. Grandpa. Rick looked at Morty, his voice low. If I trigger this, it'll shut everything down. Maybe even us. You sure you trust me? Morty met his gaze. I always do. Rick smiled faintly. Then let's make this count. He activated the device. A deep, resonant wave spread outward, cracking through the light. The figure staggered, its form splintering. Why destroy what you understand? Rick's eyes glistened, because understanding isn't the same as surrender. The hum became a roar. The world twisted, tearing at itself. Morty screamed, reaching for Rick as the ground disintegrated beneath them. And then nothing. When Morty opened his eyes, he was lying in the grass. The sky was blue again. Birds sang. The house was whole. Grandpa? Rick lay a few feet away, motionless. Morty crawled to him, shaking his shoulder. Grandpa, wake up! Rick's eyes flickered open. He smiled weakly. Told you I'd fix it. Morty laughed through tears. You did it. You saved us. Rick looked past him toward the oak tree. The ground was quiet again. No light, no hum. But somewhere deep beneath, he thought he heard a single faint pulse, steady, alive, waiting. He whispered, no one ever really deletes what they love. The wind moved through the branches, carrying the hum away into the distance, soft as a heartbeat fading into eternity. The days that followed were unnervingly quiet. No hum beneath the ground, no pulse in the air. The world seemed to breathe differently now, slow, untroubled, like an old animal finally at rest. Morty spent the first morning walking the perimeter of the yard, expecting to see the faint shimmer of light, but the grass only whispered in the wind. He crouched beneath the oak tree and pressed his ear to the soil. Silence, the kind that felt alive in its stillness. Rick sat on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders, staring into the pale morning sky. He looked older somehow, not weaker, just more human, more aware of the weight he carried. The world had reset itself, but the quiet between them held the echo of what had been of what they'd nearly become. Morty joined him, holding 2 mugs of tea. Bert took his without a word. For a while, they just sat, watching sunlight drip through the branches. The air smelled faintly of burnt circuits and wet soil. Do you think it's gone? Morty finally asked. Rick didn't answer right away. He took a sip, grimaced and sighed. Gone isn't a real thing, Morty. Just another word we use when we don't want to admit something's changed. Morty frowned. So it's still out there. Rick set the mug down, his hands trembling slightly. Maybe not out there, he said softly. Maybe in here. He tapped his temple. Or maybe in the part of the universe that remembers us when we're not looking. Morty was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You could build it again if you wanted." Rick chuckled. "Yeah, I could. But I won't." "Why not?" Rick looked at him, eyes half closed, voice calm. "Because some things only teach you when they're gone. Rebuilding them just means you weren't listening the first time." The wind shifted, brushing over them like an unseen hand. The world seemed softer now, as if tired from all its remembering. The oak tree swayed lazily, its leaves whispering secrets. Neither of them tried to understand. That night, Morty couldn't sleep. He wandered into the garage. The smell of oil and metal still lingered, but the machines were quiet. The workbench was clean except for one object, a small fragment of the stabilizer coil, dull and harmless now. Morty picked it up, rolling it in his palm. It didn't glow, didn't hum, just sat there, cold and still, like a relic from a dream. He thought about what the entity had said. We are remembering. Maybe that's what all of them were doing. Rick, him, even the world itself. Remembering, and maybe remembering was the closest anyone could ever get to forever. He placed the fragment on a shelf and turned off the light. In the morning, Rick was gone. The porch chair was empty, the blanket folded neatly over the rail. Morty felt the old panic rising in his chest. He ran through the house, calling Rick's name, checking every room. Nothing. Just the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the sunlight stretched long and gold across the grass. There was a note pinned to the door with a small bolt. Morty pulled it free. The handwriting was messy, uneven. "Kid, if you're reading this, I'm not gone. Just wandered. There's something I still need to check. You'll understand someday. Don't chase ghosts. They're faster than you think. Stay soft. Stay curious." Morty stood there for a long time, holding the note against the morning wind. He wanted to cry, but something inside him stopped it. Rick wasn't gone. Not really. The air still held the faint warmth of his presence, and the silence seemed to hum differently, as if waiting for him to return. He looked toward the oak tree. Its branches moved gently, light slipping through like water. For a moment, he thought he saw the faintest flicker beneath the soil, a small, rhythmic pulse. Not threatening, just alive. A reminder. Days turned into weeks. The world didn't break again. The machines stayed asleep. Morty started fixing small things around the house. Broken shelves, leaky pipes, things Rick never bothered with. It felt good to make things steady, to build instead of destroy. Sometimes at night he'd hear faint murmurs of Rick's voice in his dreams. Not words, just tones, echoes. As if Rick was still teaching him, somewhere between consciousness and the stars. One evening, Morty took a walk beyond the yard, past the hills and toward the place where the horizon seemed to fold into itself. He carried a flashlight but didn't turn it on. The moon was bright enough. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, almost warm. He thought about all the versions of Rick that might exist out there in other timelines and other worlds. Versions that hadn't stopped the machine. Versions that never cared to. And yet somehow this one had. The one who grew tired enough to want peace more than power. Morty smiled. "You finally did it, old man," he whispered. "You became human again." The wind carried his words away, scattering them across the open field. He stayed there until dawn. The sky shifted from indigo to gold, and when the first light touched his face, he swore he could feel a hand on his shoulder. Warm, steady, familiar. "Grandpa," he murmured, eyes half closed. No answer, only the soft hum of the morning. Years passed quietly. Morty grew older. The house aged with him, paint peeling, floors creaking, but still standing. He never moved away. Something about the place felt sacred, like it held the last living breath of a story that shouldn't be disturbed. On quiet nights, he'd sit on the porch with a mug of tea, staring at the stars. The oak tree still stood tall, its roots deep and silent. Sometimes, if the wind hit just right, he could swear he heard the faintest vibration beneath the ground. A lullaby of light. A heartbeat too soft to be real. He'd smile and whisper, "Good night, Grandpa." One night, as he drifted toward sleep, Morty dreamed of a workshop lit by starlight. Rick stood at the bench, tinkering with something small, humming under his breath. His hands were steady, his eyes calm. When he looked up, he smiled. Not the crooked smirk, Morty remembered, but something gentler. "Told you, kid," he said. "Nothing ever really ends." It just changes shape. Morty wanted to answer, but the dream was already fading, softening around the edges. He felt himself sinking into warmth, into peace, into the quiet pulse that had once terrified him but now felt like home. As he drifted deeper, he heard one last whisper, faint, amused, almost teasing. "Don't stay up too late, Morty." The dream folded into darkness. Morning came slow and kind. The sunlight crept through the curtains, brushing across Morty's still face. The house was silent, the air still. Outside, the oak tree shivered gently, scattering golden leaves across the porch. In far beneath the soil, a soft hum echoed once calm, rhythmic, eternal. Not a machine, not a memory, just the quiet continuation of something that had finally found peace. Somewhere beyond the veil of waking and dreaming, Rick's voice lingered like the last note of a song. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man."